But I think the case to be made for existential risks is just quite strong. Even if you're not on board with the whole AI thing, then you still have biotechnology, you still have other unknown risks. And you, of course, still have things like nuclear war. And it seems to me very obvious that we could end humanity in this way.
Salut chers abonnés, ici Gaëtan de The Flares et on se retrouve pour un podcast La Prospective. Cet épisode sera donc consacré aux risques existentiels. Je reçois Otto Barten qui a créé The Existential Risk Observatory. Il va nous en dire plus sur ce sujet, c'est fascinant. Mais par contre, c'est un podcast en anglais, donc il sera sous-titré français sur YouTube. Et évidemment, si vous écoutez ça sur les plateformes comme Spotify ou iTunes, sur votre téléphone par exemple, vous n'aurez pas les sous-titres. Donc il faut que vous parliez anglais. Mais peut-être que ce n'est pas un problème pour vous, je ne sais pas. Si vous aimez ce que nous faisons, le meilleur moyen de nous soutenir, c'est de nous donner un petit peu d'argent. Non, je rigole. C'est juste par exemple, un petit pouce, comme ça, hein, j'aime, clic, ou des revues sur iTunes, commentaires, partagez sur les réseaux sociaux ce podcast et les autres que nous avons fait. C'est le meilleur moyen de nous aider. Merci encore. Tout de suite, place au podcast. C'est parti.
Bienvenue sur le podcast de Quel.
So thank you, Otto, for accepting my invitation to talk about existential risks. But the first question I want to ask you is, can you introduce yourself?
So thanks a lot for inviting me. It's really nice, I think, to be at your podcast. I took a quick look at the guests that you have gathered before, and it's a really nice community, I think. So I'm happy to be there. And yes, my introduction. I'm trained as a physicist and an engineer. I worked on wind turbine technology before. Then I've spent some time in consulting, and I founded a startup company. I also did some climate activism, so I'm coming kind of from the climate and renewable energy side. But then I visited a lecture in existential risk and futurism. So this was actually called Grand Futures and Existential Risks by Anders Sandberg. Anders Sandberg is a professor in the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. And I visited this talk in London kind of randomly. I was just browsing meetup.com, visiting a friend, thinking what to do. I came across this lecture, and Anders Sandberg was kind of showing me a provocative chart that sparked my interest in this topic. This chart had on the x-axis time and very long time scales from minus 5,000 years before Christ or something until plus 5,000 years. And then on the y-axis, something of value. So according to him, this could be pretty much anything like human lives or GDP or some other metric. And then you always kind of saw the same picture that's up until 2000, this was, or up until 1850, maybe this was really boring. And then it was exploding after the Industrial Revolution. His question was, okay, so we're now there at this end of the explosion. But what happens if you extrapolate for thousands of years? Will it go up or will it go down or will it stay in between? And that kind of sparked my interest in existential risk. So when I sold my sustainable energy startup, we were doing smart charging before. I had the chance to found a new organization, and I founded the Existential Risk Observatory. That's a new NGO, and that got me into the topic very, very quickly.
So what is the Existential Risk Observatory that you created?
Yeah, so the Existential Risk Observatory is reducing human extinction risks by informing the public debate. Rather strangely, I think, there was no organization yet doing this. So according to this line that Anders Sandberg drew on his slide, there are basically two ways that humanity can go in the far future. We can go very far up because we have an enormous potential in technology to do more things and create more value. Or we could go down, and that would be a stable state that does not allow us to go up anymore. And one of the few stable states that there are that really don't allow us to go up anymore. Like if we have a world war, for example, that's a horrible thing, but it does definitely allow us to continue the upward progress. So it has to be much more dramatic than that, and that's what they call an existential risk. So an existential risk is something that could make sure that we never go to this enormous upward development anymore. And this could be human extinction. And when I heard about this for the first time, I thought, okay, human extinction, that sounds very dramatic. So this is probably something that's already discussed widely in societal debates. And this is probably something that everyone knows of already. And to my surprise, I learned that the most important sources of human extinction and also the other parts of existential risk are actually not widely discussed, but are only discussed in a relatively niche group of people. And these sources have to do with new technology. So it's basically a technology that's extremely powerful and that could go two ways. It could go very well or it could go very badly. And these technologies, or the future of these technologies, are not really widely discussed in the societal debate. And I thought this was very negative phenomena. Basically, the biggest problems are only discussed and are only acted upon by maybe a few hundred people.
Yeah. So how do you communicate? What's your strategy?
We organized the first existential risk conference in the Netherlands. That was last year. There are basically two things that we think are most successful so far and that we can do as a small organization. And one is publishing in print media. So we tried social media. We think that social media are not too active or not too suitable to communicate this message, because the bandwidth is rather low. If you have one message of 140 characters or whatever, you cannot really communicate well the full story of existential risk, because it's quite a heavy and a little bit complex story. So you want to have some bandwidth to communicate, but you also want to communicate to a lot of people at once. So we think writing op-eds for newspapers, that's a way to relatively easily get into the mainstream of news, and still be able to convey a little bit larger and more complex message. So we've written 4 op-eds in the last year in mainstream Dutch newspapers about existential risk, and especially about the one that we worry most about, that's artificial intelligence. And we get the message into the Dutch mainstream news media in this way now. And another way is to also influence leading opinion makers and to kind of convince them or kind of take them by the hand to existential risk. And we've been successful. We're still more or less in the startup phase, or I would say we just passed the startup phase and we're now scaling up. So far in the startup phase, we've been successful in let's say, convincing one mainstream opinion maker about existential risk, and he's now also writing about it. And I think if we continue this for a few years, then we can probably change the mainstream narrative that existential risk is an actual thing and that we should worry about the most important sources.
Okay. So I guess you're not doing academic research like the Future of Humanity Institute will do.
Yeah, that's right. We've written one paper actually last year, but it's not really the core of what we're doing. Basically, a lot of the research has already been done. I mean, there's still definitely a big open question, so it's very good that people are continuing this. But it's certain enough now that we have a large existential risk, and what the main causes are. So it's we think it's time to communicate this as well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good idea because it is neglected, and especially the general public doesn't really know those topics. They can also have a wrong view about them because from science fiction movies, Hollywood, sometimes they give us a wrong appreciation of the risk. Like, well, if we talk about AI, for example, we have this idea of the Terminator, or even in the Matrix, we don't really find this very credible because it's been on TV. We say, yeah, well, it's just for movies, but actually the risk is different, but it's still real. So I guess we can start to talk about those existential risks. What are the major ones?
So we follow the mainstream research in existential risk, and especially the work by Toby Ord. He's written a book, The Precipice. Toby Ord is an academic at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, a philosopher, and has a background in computer science as well. But he's written a book called The Precipice. And this is mainly about existential risk and what the main sources are and what we can do about this. So we chose not really to have our own opinion, but just to follow the most mainstream academic opinion that exists. And by the way, this is still relatively niche. So as we said before, there are a few hundred people working on this. So I think this is one of the 3 attempts to quantify the risk. And these attempts also differ quite significantly. So there is just still an enormous amount of research required. But according to him, the main existential risk sources, and we follow those estimates, are first AI. He estimates for the next 100 years what the probability is of an existential risk. And this could be human extinction or an unrecoverable collapse of humanity, or a dystopian lock-in that we can never recover from. And probably the main source of these three is human extinction. So I'm kind of using human extinction and existential risk interchangeably. But according to him, the main point is that we don't have this grand future anymore that we could otherwise have. And human extinction is a main reason why that would be true. So the main sources would be AI, probably man-made pandemics. So pandemics, you can have natural pandemics, but you can also create them yourself in a laboratory. And in natural pandemics, we have the nice circumstance that we are already living for about 300,000 years. And in these 300,000 years, there was never a pandemic that made us extinct. So we know that the probability should at least be less than 1 in 300,000 for the next year. So that's pretty low. So we know that man-made pandemics, they can be severe, like COVID, of course. But the chance that they make us go extinct is extremely small. But for man-made pandemics, we don't really have this nice circumstance, because now we can tweak things, and that makes the risk higher. So man-made pandemics is the second cause. Then unforeseen is actually the third one according to his probabilities. Man-made pandemics is 1 in 30 chance, he thinks, for the next 100 years. AI is a 1 in 10 chance. 1 in 10 is really enormous, I think. That's people sometimes talk about long-termism, like this is a black swan idea. So you have a small chance of occurring, but because the impact is so massive, you still have to put in some effort. And I think there's something to be said for that argument. But this is not a small chance of occurring. 1 in 10 chance is a massive chance. So you really want to rule this out as soon as possible. So AI is a 1 in 10 chance. Man-made pandemics 1 in 30. Unforeseen is a 1 in 30 chance. That means basically the thought experiment is okay. Or if we would have tried this 100 years ago, then we would not have included biotechnology, because we didn't have biotechnology yet. We would not have included nuclear energy. We would not have included climate change. We would not have included all these things, definitely not AI, that we know now are more or less possible. So we would probably have missed all the important things. And now we try to do the same exercise for the next 100 years. So it's quite likely that we actually missed the most powerful technologies, because we haven't invented them yet, and we haven't even thought that they might be possible. But these could also be existential risks if they're as powerful as the technologies that we're seeing now. So this is the unforeseen risks, and Toby Ord is very roughly estimating this as a 1 in 30 probability. So I think it's the way to interpret these chances, I think, is probably less than 1 in 3. It's probably more than 1 in 300. So it's really a rough thing. But it does allow you to very roughly line up the sources of risk.
Okay, so that's unforeseen, AI, and but natural, not, I guess, more like man-made pandemics. Is there because that's a category called anthropogenic risks, I think. So that's why the thought experiment is actually interesting when we think if we had to think about those risks before maybe the nuclear age. All of them are not possible because we didn't know the technologies. So I guess the other branch is the natural risks.
We should also talk, I think, about climate and nuclear energy or nuclear war. I guess those two will be the first one on the minds of many people. And I think that's understandable. And I'm coming from a climate background, so I was really concerned about climate change before as well, and I'm still really concerned. My concern hasn't diminished because these other things. But it is true that if you talk about human extinction, and of course human extinction is extremely extreme, climate change is definitely happening, of course, and we should definitely solve this urgently. But the chance that it ends up in human extinction, that's relatively small. And Toby Ord is roughly estimating this again at a 1 in 1,000 probability. And that means that if you plot this in a graph, as we have done on our website, then you see AI is enormous, man-made pandemics are quite big, other risks are quite big, and climate is vanishing. And so I've kind of had an argument with climate activists about this graph, aren't you neglecting climate change, and aren't you trying to deprioritize this? And I think that's really not the point. Of course, it's a very important topic to work on. And I still think we should definitely solve climate change. And personally, I think we should solve it sooner than we're doing now as well. But if you talk about existential risks, which is really, I would say, one order of magnitude more severe than the most likely climate scenarios, then climate change is not really a main existential risk at about roughly 1 in 1,000. Something similar is happening at nuclear winter. Also, nuclear war is, of course, extremely severe if it would happen. The most likely nuclear war, however, will also not result in human extinction. Probably we would exchange one or two atomic bombs, which is horrible enough, of course, but it doesn't automatically result in human extinction. But what could actually result in human extinction is a nuclear winter. So if we really exchange nuclear weapons, especially the arsenals of Russia and the US are the biggest ones, and if we if those arsenals would fully be used and we would have full nuclear war, then it's quite likely that we have nuclear winter. That means that soot from burning cities would be projected into the stratosphere, if I'm correct. It's the highest layer of the above the atmosphere, and it could not rain anymore down from that height, so it would just stay around there. And that would probably be for about 10 years or 15 years or something like this. And it would block the sunlight. So we would get a climate change that's quite dramatic. This could be like 10 or 15 degrees lower temperature than we currently have. And this would go on for something like 10 years, maybe. So this would be the most likely cause of extinction because of nuclear weapons or nuclear war. And Toby Ort is also estimating this at a roughly 1 in 1,000 chance. And as climate change, the chance for nuclear war in the next 100 years is actually probably bigger than 1 in 1,000. But the chance that this actually results in human extinction is relatively small.
Yeah, I find that, and I think we're going to explore a little bit more this, but the fact that we talk about human extinction is such a high bar because we are actually pretty resilient as a species. It's hard to kill everyone of us. There's still maybe someone on an island, like I live in Australia. New Zealand seems to be a pretty safe place to live, even in the case of Third World War with nukes and everything. Even the pandemic, they just have to shut down everything. So yeah, you really have to destroy the planet more or less to extinguish life on Earth and humans especially.
Unfortunately, it's very hard to do so. So that's somewhat comforting, but it also shows the seriousness, I think, of the biggest existential risks. That these existential risks are actually capable of doing that. It can appear somewhat like frivolous to talk about this and say, okay, well, the nuclear war is not such an issue because not everyone dies, but we still have 10 people left or something. That's of course not the message that you want to send. That anything else is not serious anymore. But it still makes sense, I think, to look at this category of human extinction separately, partially because of the grand futures, but also partially because it's just such a relatively big risk that's just unnoticed right now.
Yeah, I think there is an interesting thought experiment by the philosopher Derek Parfit, where he show, what's the worth between, let's say, a nuclear war that kills 99% of the population and another one that kills 100% of the population and no nuclear at all. So there was zero death. So people think, if you rank these three scenarios, the better one is obviously when there's no war, and the second is when there's 99%, and the last one is 100 or something like that. But actually, killing everyone is much more dramatic than the difference between 0 and 99% of people dead, because we have this huge generation in the future, quintillions of people spreading across the galaxy. Maybe we don't really know how big the future can be, but it's definitely huge. If we go extinct this century, for example, well, the future will not exist anymore, or the value and everything is lost. So that's why it's so important to try to mitigate those risks?
This point is important. It's made by Toby Ord very eloquently, I think, in his book, and it's made by a lot of other futurists. That the future is big. This was also already in the talk of Anders Sandberg that I witnessed, and that originally got me interested in the topic. So it was called Grand Futures and Existential Risks. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin, if you want. So the coin would be we have powerful technology. And the upside is that we have a really grand future. And of course, the future, even without technology, is already enormous. I think it's much bigger. We have about 300,000 years now as humanity. But the future is much bigger than 300,000 years. It's more in the order of, I don't know, millions or even bigger. I don't even know the order of magnitude, but it's much higher than the 300,000 years that we've had so far. So even if we just like stay on Earth and don't do anything special in that sense, then it's already much bigger than our past, and it's definitely much bigger than our present. So if you assign any kind of like weight to the people living in the future and not born now, any kind of moral weight, then you should definitely really take care of what you're doing with this future, because it's so massive. And this is still apart from technology that we could use. So with technology, we could also do things like probably space colonization. It's not an absurd idea, I think, if you extrapolate the technology that we have now. And if you include this, and also, yeah, so the futurist, I'm not calling myself a futurist, so I'm not necessarily really on board with this argument. But the futurists are also saying is that we could also organize a lot more of consciousness. So maybe we could do mind uploading. Maybe we could stuff many more consciousness beings in a certain amount of cubic meters in the universe, or a certain amount of kilograms of matter. And then the future would become massively bigger even. So the future it's already very big, but if you follow the futurist in these thought experiments, then it gets much bigger still. And if you assign, and I think that's apart from whether you're a futurist or not, but if you assign any kind of moral weight to future beings, then you should really take care what you're doing with this future, and that makes human extinction like a separate and kind of unique category.
Everyone, when we talk about extinction, we tend to remember our, when we were kids, we like dinosaurs. Extinction equal big asteroid coming towards Earth and killing all the life on Earth. And most of the every mass extinction since the beginning of life on Earth came from natural origin. There was no technology, obviously, so it's still something we need to remember, that nature is not really nice. When when things go wrong, we are at its mercy in a way. So what are the natural risks?
Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting that before we knew about these risks that killed off the dinosaurs, for example, and before we knew about things like evolution and geological timescales, many people could not even imagine going extinct. It was just the only thing we could imagine. Maybe was a religious figure coming back and ending it all, but there would still be heaven or whatever. But we could not really imagine that nature would actually make us go extinct. So I think this idea was also treated with quite a bit of skepticism when it arrived, that you could actually have an asteroid coming into Earth and killing everyone. And this is, of course, what we've seen with the dinosaurs, and it could also happen to us. But I think the parallel is also interesting, that it was hard to imagine. And I think right now we also have a hard time imagining technology that we're producing ourselves, making us go extinct. But this could still be the case as well. But indeed, coming back to the natural risks. So the most important ones are supervolcano and meteorites. And the meteorites is really well known. So right now we have a very good estimate of how many meteorites there are and what the probability is that it would hit the Earth. And also, even better, we have kind of an outlook system to know whether a meteorite is coming our way. So we have a really good idea about what the probability is, and it's probably very low. I think it's in the order of 1 of 100,000 or even 1 in a million for the next 100 years. So this probability is very small. It's quite well known, and we even have somewhat of a defense system. I think if something would actually come our way, then we might even be able to do something about it with a rocket. It might not be a good idea to have this defense system. That's another interesting thought, I think, because you could also use this defense system. You could use it to divert a meteorite away from the Earth, but you could also use it to change the course of the meteorite towards the Earth. So you could also use it as an attack system. So actually having this system, it's not obvious that this is a good idea from existential risk perspective. But anyway, the point is that the chance is really small that this happens, a natural extinction event. And even if it would happen, at least for meteorites, we could probably do something about it. So that's relatively comforting. And then we have supervolcanoes. Supervolcanoes are probably somewhat higher probability, but still very low. I think it's in the order of 1 in 10,000. And the bulk of the natural extinction risk is probably coming from supervolcanoes. So this would be like an eruption of the Yellowstone supervolcano, and I think there are probably a few more worldwide, and there's not really that much that we could do about this at this moment. And there's also not a great warning system. We could probably not really see it coming if that would actually happen. So that would be the biggest risk, but it's still about 1 in 10,000. We also know quite certain how high the risk is because we have historical data. So we're really certain that this is not a 1 in 100 chance or something. It's really somewhere along the 1 in 10,000 probability. So that's relatively comforting. So I think the main message about natural risks should be that we shouldn't worry about those, but we should worry about anthropogenic risks.
Yeah. Because there is also the idea that as we grow, as we become technologically mature, we might be able to fight those risks if they occur. Even supervolcano, maybe there is a way to stop them before they become too dangerous, because maybe with just some kind of pressure release, if we dig a hole in the volcano and we try to let some steam out, I don't know, and maybe we can reduce the supervolcano risk, or if we had a good warning system, for example, and obviously the asteroid, we can deflect them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, we could also still go to space. That's kind of an obvious solution. I don't know whether Elon Musk will be successful with his Mars mission, but I think it's not absurd to say that at some point, if technology development continues and we measure time in hundreds of years, then at some point we might enter space, and of course then we would not be so fragile anymore for Earth-bound existential risks. So I think that's another reason that if we got things, then it's fairly unlikely that it is because of something like a supervolcano.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And so according to you, which existential risk is the most likely to happen first? Do you agree with Toby Ord that AI is the most likely?
We might say that the probabilities are even a bit higher than Toby Ord, but we basically go with his probability. So Toby Ord's book was written, or it was published in, I think, 2020. So it's about 2 years ago, and it's not so long, but in AI, the developments are going really rapidly. And there have been a few updates in the last 2 years that AI might be even more dangerous, or at least it might be the probability that we get AI soon has increased, I think, in the last few years. But we're basically following Toby Ord's arguments that the probability for AI is the highest, and then we have biorisk, and then unforeseen. So according to this thought experiment, it's interesting that unforeseen could be even larger. But I think what's also central, probably now I'm interpreting Toby Ord's work a little bit, but I think what's also part of the reason that he presents the order like he does is that he and many people at the Future of Humanity Institute think that at some point we will probably have supernatural intelligence. So we probably will be able to have an AI that's at least as capable as us in solving certain tasks. And I think a mainstream thought in that in this group of people is that this AI can then help us to solve all our other problems, basically. So we could go extinct because of the AI if it really goes off track. But if we do keep it aligned, then it's enormously powerful. So we might be able to use it to reduce all these other existential risks. And I think that's one of the reasons that some of the other existential risks, such as nanotechnology, get a bit lower probability, because they expect, okay, once we have AI, then we can probably use this to solve a lot of the other problems that we have.
Yeah, that's definitely the case because I think there is also this idea of differential technological development. I think that's the term, or it's the idea that we should try to push forward the technologies that will help us in a way rather than the one that increase the risk. And that's why there is some sort of fight, maybe not the right word, but there is a battle between AI safety and just AI period. So, obviously there is a lot of economic incentive to have, when we say AI, we mean AGI and super AI, of course, which are, let's say, artificial intelligence that are more smarter than human beings, basically. So the idea is to try to have some sort of safeguard, and that's the whole alignment value and alignment problem. It's very complicated. So can you maybe explain a little bit how AI is such a risk? Because I think it's easy for some people to imagine, for example, a pandemic that was created in a lab by some malicious actors, because we know what the pandemic is now, and even during throughout history we know the damage of a pandemic. But AI is some sort of abstract thing. Nowadays AI is used on Google to recognize cats and dogs and to maybe drive a car, but we don't really see the path leading to the extension of the human race from AI. It's very abstract. So, do you know a few scenarios, and can you explain a little bit more?
Yes, sure. So I think that this is very important. This is crucial for the whole existential risk message, because one of 10 probability, that's about 2/3 of the entire existential risk. That's estimated at 1 in 6 by Toby Ord. So a lot of this is AI. So it's very important to understand why this is an existential risk, and to also look at what we can do about it. So it starts, of course, with the rapid improvements that AI is going through. So we have the number of neurons in a large neural network right now has about surpassed it in our own brains. And about 15 years ago, the situation was completely different. Sometimes I'm speaking to people who studied AI and they graduated in 2005, and they're like, "Oh, these neural networks are not going to do anything." But these were the networks in 2005, and they had maybe 1,000 neurons or something. And right now we have 100 billion, I think, neurons, and that's roughly the number. In at least we've passed already the number of neurons in our own neural network in our brains by AI. And it doesn't mean that it's already as intelligent as us, but it is as complex, you might say, as we are. And I think quite soon the number of floating point operations per second will also follow that pattern. So it means that AI can do as many calculations as our human brain can per second. So the complexity and the calculation power is basically is surpassing us roughly at this moment, plus or minus a few years. And after that, of course, it's not true that after that you already have intelligence that is as good as ours. That's still, we definitely haven't found it yet, but it is somewhat uncomforting from a risk management perspective that we do seem to have the calculation power. So it's basically a programming problem between brackets that we have to solve, and it's very uncertain when we will solve this programming problem. Right now, we get very good results with a relatively simple approach of just scaling up neural networks. So the basic approach of a neural network is already old. It has been developed maybe in the 60s. And what we're doing now and what's driving a lot of the progress is simply throwing more computing power at it. And computing power is growing extremely rapidly, and this is why the technology is getting a lot better now. And we see right now that if we just keep throwing more, if we keep putting more layers in the neural network, if we keep feeding it more data, and if we keep throwing more compute at it, then it just becomes more and more intelligent. And the big question, one of the big questions, is whether this trend will continue all the way towards as intelligent as we are, because it's not yet as intelligent as we are now, but it is definitely improving along those lines. So if this trend would continue, this is called the scaling hypothesis, then we should end up with artificial general intelligence. So that means AI basically that is as smart as us, or as capable as we are in doing all kinds of tasks and not just a few tasks. Then we should end up with this AGI relatively soon. Or the scaling hypothesis could be wrong, and it could be that we need a lot more detailed algorithms or more complicated research that would lead us to human intelligence, and that could take a lot longer. And it's kind of it's really unknown at this moment when this will occur, and also if it will occur. But most AI scientists do agree that it will occur somewhere in this century, and there's a big push, I think, now to or there are a lot of people now that are convinced that it will happen a lot sooner, especially if the scaling hypothesis would hold.
So that will be before 2050, maybe?
Yeah, if the scaling hypothesis would hold, then I guess it's well before 2050. So Ray Kurzweil is also, of course, a well-known futurist, and he tried to predict singularity. According to him, the singularity would be at 2045, but human level AI would already be there at 2029, I think, according to his predictions. And according to his predictions, the compute to make that happen would already be there at 2023. So he guessed that we would need about 6 more years to develop the software, basically, to develop the algorithms. But then in 2029, we would have human level AI. And for some reason, he thought it would take 60 more years from that point until the singularity. But it's fairly conservative, you might say. So if you just follow his line of thought for extrapolating computing power, then it could already be relatively soon that we end up with human level intelligence.
Yeah, I think there is a really good study by the Open Philanthropy, which is an institute in the US. And I think Aya Kotra, it's a researcher. She put a report on this, and she tried to map the future of computing. And I think she has a few dates, but the soonest is in the 2030s. Maybe 32, 33, and that's very soon.
I think it's interesting that no one knows, basically. It really depends on, so we don't know what's in our own brain, of course. Nobody has deciphered how our brain works. So we also don't really know how hard it is to reproduce it. And it could be relatively easy, it could be relatively hard, and it's just, it's basically anyone's guess. But if you see the developments now, especially I think Gato is an important one. So DeepMind is a company in the UK with about 1,300 people that's explicitly trying to develop human level AI. And recently they've released a model called Gato. For the first time, this was able to carry out a large number of tasks with a single model. So up until now, my talk used to be, okay, we have AI that can only do one thing, like driving a car, playing Go, playing chess, but it cannot do many things. But then you have artificial general intelligence, and that can do all kinds of things. But we don't have that yet, and it might be very far in the future. But Gato was now released, and it's a single model, and it can do about 600 tasks, including quite diverse things like building something with a robot arm, but also chatting with people in natural language, also recognizing pictures. So quite diverse tasks, but only one network with the same weights that was trained only once, basically. So this is already a breakthrough that seems to go a little bit in the direction of one model that can do many different tasks. And then, of course, the question is that also going into the direction of one model that can do any task better than we can do? That would be the definition of AGI.
Let's say we are in 2035 and we achieved AGI or super AI. Why this milestone would lead to human extinction? Why a super AI wouldn't kill us all?
So it would not. There's a few things that it would not need to do. So it would not need to be conscious, for example. Some people say, okay, before an AI could make its own decisions, it would first need to have some sort of consciousness. But that doesn't seem to be the case. The only thing basically that's needed is that it's better than we are at solving problems, and that it has a goal that's unaligned with ours, so that it has a different goal than what we want. And if it has a different goal, so the thought experiment is the paperclip optimizer. Let's say this is by Bostrom, I think, Nick Bostrom, also a futurist, or it might be by Yudkowsky, I think. Eliezer Yudkowsky is an important name that inspired a lot of Bostrom's thought. And he's saying, okay, let's say we have an AGI and its only goal is to produce as many paperclips as possible. Then how would it go about doing that? Well, okay, it would probably it would be as capable as we are, so it would be able to do any task by definition as good as we are, as we can do this. So it would make sense that it would think, okay, if I want to make as many paper clips as possible, I should first improve myself. So I should first become better at doing random tasks, because then I can also carry out this task better. So it would make sense that it started to develop itself and gone through its own code, perhaps, or at least trying to improve itself, and it would be as capable as we are. And currently, we are improving AI, so apparently we're able to do this. So according to the definition, the AGI would also be able to do this. And then after improving itself, this could be quite rapidly, because perhaps there are still opportunities in improving codes. We have created an improvement ourselves of about 45x the last 10 or 15 years, I think. So the algorithms that we have now for AI have become about 45 times better in the last 15 years. So apparently there's a lot of space for improvements in code in general. And perhaps this AI could also become a lot more intelligent relatively quickly. And then its goal would be to make as many paper clips as possible. So it would still go about making more and more paper clips, and at a certain point it would end up with a huge number of paper clips, but it would still want to create more. And of course, we are also ourselves made out of molecules, and as the rest of Earth and as the rest of the universe is. So it would make sense that this AI would also transform basically everything, including us, into paper clips. So this is kind of a silly example of an AI having a goal that's unaligned with ours, and it looks kind of harmless. It doesn't try to destroy us. It's not conscious, and it's not even a bad actor necessarily. It's not a terrorist or something that has this AGI, but just a normal company that says, okay, I would like to have as many paper clips as possible, and then the result is that you have an intelligence explosion, and it transforms us into paper clips, and we all die. So that's the thought experiment leading to human extinction. Yeah, this is one thought experiment, but the basic line of thought is, if you have an AI and a certain goal that has not been thought out very carefully, then because we don't control it anymore, it could go in all kinds of directions. And this, in some scenarios, this could include human extinction as well.
It's an example that sometimes people laugh about it, because they think, how can a very intelligent agent carry out a stupid goal like that? And the idea is to show that there is some sort of orthogonality between intelligence, capabilities, and goals and values. Because clearly, if this AI isn't conscious, for example, it will not really think about moral consideration, and there is also some. I guess we could draw parallels with our situation towards some animals. For example, ants. We don't really want to kill them all, but if we want to create a highway, we will not really care about anthills on the way. We won't even try to remove them. We're just gonna pour concrete and asphalt, and that's the end of the anthill. So I guess the AI could do something on the planetary scale. I really like the idea of the Hitchhiker's Guide of the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. I don't know if you read this book or if you saw the movie. There is this alien civilization that's trying to create a highway through hyperspace, and the planet Earth is in the way. And they just come and destroy us.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's funny as well, that this is actually it's actually a relevant example. And there are many relevant ideas, I think, coming from sci-fi, because strangely, there's not a lot of people seriously thinking about a future with much better technology than we have now. Even though this is a very likely scenario, I mean, our technology has improved enormously, so it really makes sense that we have a future with much better technology than we have now. But the only people trying to think out scenarios of what would actually happen there are sci-fi authors. I think that's extremely bad, actually, and it's weird that this is true. But this is one of the. Of course, it's a bit of a joke, but it is related to a scenario where an AI has a goal and we're just in the way, like you say, like an anthill on the road. Maybe one more thing that's also important is that actually AI experts have tried to work on this problem, and it's kind of a difficult problem to solve because the AI isn't there yet. So you have a system and you want to make sure it doesn't do anything you don't like, but the system doesn't exist yet. So it's difficult to align this, but the work that I've done right now still seems to point at a difficulty of aligning AI, even the models that we have now, and this problem will probably get worse in the future. So they've tried to solve this control problem or the alignment problem for maybe about 10 years with not too many people, but still a few dozen or maybe a few hundred people with good relevant technical backgrounds, and they haven't been successful. And so far, they're also saying that it looks really hard, and they're fairly pessimistic. Hopefully, they'll solve it in time, but they're fairly pessimistic that well, some are more optimistic than others, but at least they haven't solved it at this moment. So it seems to be a hard problem.
Yes, definitely. Do you try to, with the Existential Risk Observatory, to I don't know, try to convince some researcher as well to work on that issue, or try to raise money to give to institute?
Not directly. We're mainly not doing this because it's not the most neglected part to do. So we think there are very roughly two ways to reduce existential risk by AI. You could either not build the technology, or you could build the technology safely. And not building the technology seems very hard, but building the technology safely also seems very hard. And so far, almost all of the effort has been directed to building the technology safely, and especially to talking to AI developers, and also to raising money for building AI safety. So there's now quite a bit of funding actually available, mostly from tech billionaires like Jan Tallinn has funded quite a bit. Elon Musk is funding some things. There's a few others as well. Sam Bankman-Fried is a recent crypto billionaire who has chopped in. So they have quite a bit of money to develop AI safety. That's the good news, I guess. But other things are at this moment more neglected, we think, and we think that there is a societal debate needed, that basically everyone should know about these problems, and then we should together try to reduce the existential risk in the best way possible. And this is more neglected, we think, than the technical AI safety work. So we're not really focusing on that because relatively more people are already doing that.
It's a little bit like global warming in a way, that there's some criticism from people when they hear about this actually research on existential risk, that like you said, global warming is not really on top of the priority, yet people are very worried about it, and we seem to move too slowly towards a transition to green energies. But it's absolutely not neglected. There's hundreds of billions every year invested in green energies, and it's just a matter of time, we think, at this point, because the technology exists. So we clearly can solve that issue and phase out fossil fuels. It's a little bit too late to avoid some of the disasters, unfortunately, and we don't really know the consequences of mass migration, this kind of thing. Maybe that will create instability that could lead to conflict and maybe nuclear war. And actually, a question I'd like to ask you about compounding. Do you think sometimes with existential risk, it's not necessarily a list of things that could go wrong, but maybe it's domino effect that we could have. Like global warming could lead to a conflict, and then nuclear war, and then on top of that, because there is a conflict, there is a group that is interested to create viruses and unleash this on the world. So we have extinction is actually the result of more than one risk.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are quite a number of these situations where one risk ties into another risk. So it could be that because of maybe rapid AI development could spark a bio existential risk, for example. I just read about a startup that's using neural networks to develop biotechnology, and they have the vision of radically changing making it a lot more easy to develop biotechnology. And there's a lot of really great things that you could do with this technology, but perhaps it could also make the existential risk from biotechnology worse. And of course, another well-known example is indeed, I think, climate change could lead to war, could lead to global instability, for migration or otherwise. And this could make indeed, like you say, I think war and therefore nuclear winter more likely. So there are a lot of ways in which these different risks tie into each other and make each other potentially worse, or they could also make each other better, of course. I mean, if you have artificial general intelligence and you do manage to control it, then you can probably solve a lot of other problems with this. Perhaps there are definitely also very useful applications of biotechnology, and perhaps you can also use those to make climate change less bad. So they could also help each other, but they could also harm each other in quite complex ways. And there is quite a bit of research about this, and people that look into the crossover effects. As an existential risk observatory, we chose not really to communicate this too much, because we think that still most of the risk is coming from basically a single technology developed while the rest of the world is in principle in a fine shape. It could be that everything goes well, but we still develop AI, and it could still cause an existential risk. But it's kind of counterintuitive. You would kind of expect that a messy world is preceding an existential risk, but it's not necessarily the case. It could also be that you have a really clean world and everything's going fine, but then you still have one existential risk and you just cannot control it. And we think these situations might actually be at the core of a large part of the risk. So we are focusing on mostly on single risks, but these crossover effects are also very interesting for sure.
Extinction is such a high bar, as we said, but there is also other catastrophes that could very well, I mean, set us back to the Stone Age for thousands of years, nuclear war. But so I think it's called global catastrophe. Do you also study and try to communicate about that? Global civilizational collapse, for example, could be a very bad thing for our future.
Yes, I think global catastrophic risks are definitely also very interesting, but we're not really focusing on this. We're a small startup of right now about 3 FTE. So this existential risk is really enough on our hands. So we definitely don't say that these global catastrophic risks, like things that could potentially destroy half of the world or something, or just set back civilization, similar to perhaps the collapse of the Roman Empire or something like this. There are a lot of more possibilities than these technologies that we've discussed right now that could do that, and fortunately other people are also studying this, but we think that right now the existential risks are the most serious and the most urgent problem, so we keep focusing on that.
Yeah, again, it's about this weighing the importance of, morally, the importance of the future, because even if there is a global collapse, well, it will just delay our potentially, because we will probably come back at the end and regain the technologies that we have now and carry forward to the stars. Maybe there's just the same way after the end of the Roman Empire, which is usually the main example when we talk about the collapse. Well, the Roman Empire never really collapsed because, first of all, there was only the Western Roman Empire, because then there was Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire was still thriving after 476, I think. It's the date of the collapse.
If you look at the graph in very long time scales, then you usually don't even see these like smaller collapses, like also things like the Second World War or the Spanish flu, or right now Corona. You hardly see those spots on a graph if you zoom out. Collapse of the Roman Empire was a particularly bad one, but we still definitely managed to come back as civilization and to develop our technology. And even something worse, I've heard the argument from Andy Sandberg at his lecture. I thought it was quite interesting that the hunter-gatherer society is probably unstable. So even if you go back to something as primitive as a hunter-gatherer society, you probably develop technology in the end if you still have human beings. So yeah, at a very long time scales, if you look at like millions of years, then there are very few states that are relevant. And the existential risk is trying to like make an overview of those states, and this is why we think it's an important problem. But basically, you should also just I think in general, you should pick a problem and then go for that one. And we've picked existential risk, but it doesn't mean that anything else is not worth the fight, of course. But this seems to be a particularly urgent one and neglected one and bad one right now.
Are you not afraid a little bit about the idea that by talking about it, you almost make it more likely, especially talking about engineered pandemic? If we got too much into it, we could give ideas to terrorists, and especially I think there is also this idea of suffering risks, which is usually X risks and S risks. So X it's for existential risk, and S risks it's for suffering risk. And there is actually a few research institutes working on that, but they are extremely reluctant to talk about their research because basically they're trying to think all day about what could go horribly wrong, that could create a lot of suffering on the planet, and that's not really something you want to talk about too much. So I don't know if that's a worry you have.
And it is an issue. For existential risk, people tend to call this information hazards. And I think the existence of information hazards itself is not an information hazard, so it's probably good to talk about that. But indeed, that can be an issue. I think for biotechnology, it's the one where I see it most obviously. Is that indeed you might also give bad ideas to some people. So we would not communicate about technical details for sure. And we might not communicate. In general, it is good to point to weaknesses in the system that people can solve, especially if they're actionable, especially if you think, okay, if people would solve this weakness in the system, then it would make our situation a lot better than it is now. But it's not necessarily good to talk about ways in which you could make this worse easily. So it does. That does worry me sometimes, but I think the risk that we have now from new technologies is so urgent and it's so large and it's so unsolved that we really need help for solving these technologies. Right now, I think that the roughly 300 people that are working on this right now, I think they're fighting an uphill battle and they need help to solve these existential risks from these new technologies, which is why I think it is important to talk about this. But it's true that this is also kind of a dangerous potentially thing to do, to talk about existential risks. And there are a few information hazards that you need to take into account as well, I think.
Do you believe in this? It's called the hinge of history hypothesis, I think. It's basically the idea that we are at a turning point, and this century, like the 21st century, might be the most important century for our species and possibly for life on Earth, which seems extremely arrogant to say. And I guess every generation think they are special, but there are actually good arguments to make for this hypothesis. What do you think?
Yeah, I do kind of think that we're at the hinge of history, and I also agree that it is unlikely. If you look at the history of humanity, it has been a very long process. So how large is the chance that at this moment we are at the hinge of history and we could really propel things upward or downward, depending on our actions? But I think the case to be made for existential risks is just quite strong. Even if you're not on board with the whole AI thing, then you still have biotechnology, you still have other unknown risks. And you of course still have things like nuclear war. And it seems to me very obvious that we could end humanity in this way. And if we would do so, then that would also have a really long-term lasting effect. So because of these arguments, especially, I think the hinge of history hypothesis does make sense at this point because the technology we developed. Perhaps if we do not develop the strongest technology right now, then perhaps the next century is actually the hinge of history. I guess that's a possibility that we manage to survive this century, and that we do not develop the strongest technology. And in fact, the strongest technology would be developed in the next century, for example. That would be a possibility. But I think we're relatively close, regardless. We're definitely a lot closer than people have ever been, I think, in the history of humanity.
I tend to agree as well, but I'm not sure. I need to think about it a bit more because definitely it's hard to, especially when we think about this huge, long future, this grand future ahead of us. Who knows if this is the century that will, completely change the trajectory of humankind and our descendants. But I think, yeah,
At least we could screw it up right now. I think that's one point that you can make. And whether this permanent high state is attainable, I think that's a possibility. It could be that we develop AI, for example, in a good way, and this will help us to solve all the other existential risks, or that we develop society in another really sustainable way. But what we're doing now is probably unsustainable, and not only because of the most obvious, like climate and nature reasons, biodiversity and things like this. That this is unsustainable, but also the way we develop technology now is unsustainable in the sense that either at some point we've developed everything, or at some point we go extinct because it's too powerful and we cannot control it anymore. But it doesn't seem to be a stable trajectory that we're now in. Before we are at any kind of a long-term sustainable society, then something will need to happen. And I think the century that we're in right now, the 21st century, is quite a likely one, and this will happen. So that would support a hinge of history.
Yeah, and there is this idea of attractor state, that there is a state that we can't really escape from, and the obvious one is extinction, because when a species is extinct, it's forever. You don't come back from extinction, except some very hypothetical scenarios where you have a civilization that find your DNA and bring back the species the same way we could do it with mammoth, but it's very speculative, and I don't think we should count on that. But another attractor state could be a very positive one, where we are basically an extremely stable galactic civilization, let's say. We could flourish. We could be almost immortal in a way as a civilization until the end of the universe, maybe. That's another attractor state, and I think this century could be the moment where we decide if we're going to go down or up. That's an interesting way to put it. There is also this interesting paper by Nick Bostrom again. He's clearly the man of the field in a way, and it's called the vulnerable world hypothesis. I don't know if you've read the or if you're familiar with it. It's basically the idea that we don't know if we live in a world where if we develop one technology, by just the fact of developing the technology means we are extinct because of the consequences. And one of the solution, and that's the creepy part of the whole argument, is we need to establish some sort of singleton or world government that is extremely let's say dystopic in a way, because there will be a lot of mass surveillance, and basically this government will need to know what we do with our hands all the time, because in this hypothetical world everyone could develop extremely bad virus, or because the technology is very cheap, or
Yeah, I've read it, and I think it's a really good paper. I would recommend people to read it. But I agree that the conclusion is hard to accept, but I think the argument is strong. So I would focus on the argument for the paper, and especially the idea that at some point we might get technology that is really available to us, available to anyone but that could kill us all. So he calls it the easy nukes, I think. So let's assume that not only right now, I mean, people could kill us all, like someone like Putin or Donald Trump, or they could press one button by one person and basically kill everyone. So this is possible, but it's only possible for very few people. But let's assume that we have easy nukes. So it means that anyone could build a nuke in their backyard, and thereby anyone could kill us all. Then you have a much more dangerous hypothetical world, and this is, I think, what Nick Bostrom is arguing. And if we actually develop technology that could do this, and AI is a candidate, biotechnology is also a candidate, but there might be more. then that's a really problematic situation, and we should think about how to handle this. Where I kind of tend to disagree with Bostrom, what Bostrom is saying is that developing this technology is inevitable and it will be there in any case. And it will also be democratized in any case. So in any case, if we develop an easy nukes technology, then anybody will have access to it. And then the solution is to control the actions of everyone. I tend to think that it might be easier to control the people developing this technology. So somehow trying to make sure that this technology does not get to a point where everyone has access. I tend to think that's easier than to control the use of everyone. So I'm not really agreed with this conclusion that the solution would be kind of a universal surveillance state. That's what he's basically proposing. And of course, this is a horrible thing. I mean, Nick Bostrom doesn't want to have a universal surveillance state either, but he thinks that this is the solution for this problem that he's pointing out. And I think this problem could be a real problem. It's not a real problem at this point because we don't have an easy nukes technology. But if we would get one, then it's a real problem that needs to be solved somehow. And I think it's definitely worth thinking about this in advance.
Yeah. Because there is a little bit of a paradox in this, because in order to prevent an existential risk, you almost have to implement one, which will be this lock-in scenario of a mass surveillance state. Not necessarily evil, but it's still pretty stable if we use technology to control people in a really effective way, maybe mind control or micro surveillance. So yeah, it's also, we haven't really talked about those risks that are not based on human extinction, but they are more on the dystopian side of things. AI could be used as a tool to enslave humanity in a way for millions of years, and that's an existential risk.
Yeah, that's right. So the definition of Toby Ord again is that existential risk is a risk that threatens the destruction of humanity's long-term potential. So this could include human extinction, what we've so far talked about, and what I think is the most likely scenario at this point. But there's also unrecoverable collapse or a dystopian lock-in. And an unrecoverable collapse would need to be extremely severe. But a dystopian lock-in could also be an option that we have. For example, like in North Korea on steroids or something with an AI controlling everyone. If AI is going in the wrong direction, then this could be a stable state, I think. So it is something that we should worry about as well.
I think there is also a case to be made for global governance, stronger global governance, and maybe the United Nations could have an existential risks department. I don't know. It could be an interesting option, but we need to put those ideas forward on the international scale, basically with our leaders, because they're taking the decision. They're not always aware of those decisions, that the consequences of the decision and the problem of existential risk. So.
Yeah, I think it's not obvious how to solve these problems, and that's one of the main reasons I think why existential risks are so dangerous, is that we don't really know what to do about them at this point. But it is clear that this really ties into the value systems that we have. For example, if you're weighing the future beings, if the moral weight that you put on future beings is high, then it leads to potentially different solutions than if your moral weight on future beings would not be present. The thoughts that you have on society and what it should look like are potentially important for the decisions that you make. So I think that's one reason why it's important to have societal debate about this, and to talk about the risks that we see with different actors in society, and also includes value systems of everyone in society and try to find a democratic solution for this. That's one reason I think why it's important to have societal debates about existential risk. You don't want to have 30 nerds in a room with a niche ethical system deciding what the future is going to look like for everyone. I think that's a really bad idea. But also simply more pragmatically, you can also simply see that right now, some future technologies are going into a direction which would be very dangerous, and that's also something that we just need to solve, and probably we need societal debate for that.
And also, I think sometimes indirect technologies could lead to a change in mentality that could result in reducing existential risk. For example, anti-aging technologies. If you think about it, there's more and more people working on trying to solve aging in a way. So it's a very transhumanist project. But if we could stop aging or be healthy longer, and we could live 2, 3, 5 centuries, let's say, then we start to think about the future differently. And I don't think, because now the problem is we tend to discount the future. We don't really care about our great grandchildren. Who knows what the future will look like. We don't really feel that we need to protect them. We can care about our children, our grandchildren, but then it goes quickly to zero, because basically. But if we live longer, we will live the future. We will be there in 3 centuries with very advanced AI. So maybe we should try to put more money into anti-aging, so we could solve aging sooner and then care about existential risk sooner. And
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which these risks, but also the opportunities, tie into each other, and these can be quite complex, like the one you described. I think, yeah, it depends. I mean, some people really care about their own future. Some people really care about their children's or grandchildren's future. But like you say, the far future can be difficult, and there are multiple ways of solving this. I also kind of liked there was a Japanese experiment where people imagined. So I think that they put 100 people together, let them make a decision, and I think half of them or something was imagining to living in the future. So they were imagining to be 100 years in the future, and they also had a voice in determining the decision. And what the result was that people did actually make a lot more sustainable decisions for the long-term future. So there could be many ways, I think, to make people think more about the future and make decisions that are consistent with a sustainable future. And I think we should definitely think about all these ways to do that.
Right. Okay. So I think we've reached the end of this podcast. Just one last thing. If people want to know more about your research and your this existential risk observatory, can they find you online? Do you have a social media presence?
Indeed, our website is existentialriskobservatory.org. So anyone can visit this, and on the bottom of the website there are links to our social accounts. We're on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. We also have a YouTube channel, and that contains recordings of the conference, the Existential Risk Conference that we had last year. So you can find a lot more information there. Also, if you're generally interested in existential risk, I would recommend people to just start at Wikipedia. As always, there's a global catastrophic risk entry that's quite good, containing some existential risk info, and there's also a good article on existential risk because of AI. I think that's a good place to start. I think also it might be important as an individual to go over what you can do about this, because it does seem to be a little bit abstract, but it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do. In fact, we seem to be at a point where we can do really a lot. So I think as an individual, it's good to read into the topic first. Toby Orr's The Precipice is a really good starting point. There's this website, 80,000 Hours. It's run by an effective altruism-related organization. That's also a good starting point of informing yourself. A book, Human Compatible by Stuart Russell. He's a professor in AI. That's a good point of starting to inform yourself about AI existential risk. Then after informing yourself, I think spreading the knowledge is a really good idea. So you should, I think, talk to other people about this, people around you, especially if you know people with platforms like podcasts or journalists or other people with platforms. Then it's probably important to inform them about existential risks. What you could also do as an individual, let's say that you are a scientist, or that you know a scientist, or that you're studying at a university, could try to make this university do more research into reducing the existential risks. That's probably quite important. But also perhaps do research into how to communicate the existential risks effectively. And you could perhaps consider donating to organizations that are doing research into this. Right now, some of the organizations are donated quite well, so it's a bit of a question mark whether you should, as an individual, prioritize putting money into those organizations. But there might be organizations that are still neglected, and then donating for those is also probably a good idea. So there's a lot that you can do as an individual. I think that's the important message.
All right, and I'll put all the links in the description of this podcast so people can find out more. Right. Well, thank you again, Otto, for this conversation. That was fascinating.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I also really like to talk with you about it and to talk in general about this. So I think it's an important topic that people should put a lot more attention in. And I really want to thank you for providing me the opportunity to be here. Thanks a lot.
Merci d'avoir suivi ce podcast jusqu'au bout. Je vous invite à aller regarder nos autres contenus que nous avons créés depuis le début de l'humanité, parce que ça fait 300 000 ans qu'on fait ça. Alors, vous pouvez aller voir les vidéos, les podcasts, documentaires, voilà, ce genre de choses. En attendant, je vous dis merci encore. Moi, je suis Gaëtan de The Flares et je vous dis à la prochaine.